I'm so excited to be here. I was like, over the moon excited when Vanessa reached out and asked if I would do this, because I think now more than ever, this is something we need to talk about. First, before I dive in, I want to acknowledge that talking about trauma can affect us in unpredictable ways. And I want to encourage everyone in this space to take care of themselves and do whatever they need to. That's in staying off camera, not communicating in the chat, or even leaving if you need to. So a little bit more about me. I am a social worker by training. I have my master's of social work and my PhD is in social welfare from the University at Buffalo School of Social Work. But I have been studying human behavior and well-being for almost 2 decades, starting in experimental psychology, where I looked at peer relations and social bullying, or bullying across development. I started life out wanting to be a police officer. I am Canadian. I was in the Canadian military reserves, but I found my home when I found social science research, and even more when I found social work. At the University at Buffalo School of Social Work, where I did my PhD, everything we do at UB is trauma informed. Our practice, our research, our service is trauma informed. So that's really where I started digging into that. So that's, almost 12 years now, at least. And so in 2019, I came to Michigan and to the School of Information at the University of Michigan. And that's when I started extending and applying my knowledge in tech and UX research and design and moderation spaces, etc. Because what I realized is the folks in tech and the people at the School of Information are interested in very similar things I am, is the understanding that technology has on people, but none of them knew about trauma. And I will say, I've been talking about this for a while, and it's only recent that everyone else is starting to grab onto it. And I really think like COVID had a lot to do with that, because when I first started trying to publish some of this work in academic computing spaces, they said, what is trauma and why should we care? Now the whole world knows what trauma is. So that's a little bit about me. I've been doing this for over a decade, been studying humans and well-being for over a decade, and social worker by training. So before I dig into the first topic, which is describing what trauma is, I want to remind everyone to take care of themselves, and in that, don't forget to breathe. Because I will describe some traumas, and many of them, I think many folks in this space will likely have lived experience of or know someone who has. So please don't forget to breathe. So what is trauma? Let's start with prevalence. Research shows that globally speaking, at least 70% of the world acknowledges experiencing at least one traumatic event in their lifetime. But almost a third of them say that they have 4 or more experiences. In the US, which is where I'm based again, at least 90% of people have experienced at least one trauma in their life. So this tells us that trauma is not only a human experience, but it's a global health epidemic. In the United States each year, research finds that you could probably fill about 9 football stadiums with the number of you who have been harmed in their lifetime. In Australia, research found, when I dug into this, 2.7 million Australians under the age of 18, or 1 in 7, have experienced childhood abuse. Worldwide, that's 1 in 2. So adults and then kids. So trauma has no age restriction or limit. We experience it from birth through to death. And so that's what makes trauma a human experience and why this topic is so important. From my research, because again, I've been doing this for a while, what I've come to realize is many people who experience trauma don't recognize it as such. And that's largely because when I ask people, have you experienced trauma? And if we had time, I would love to go around the room and say, what does trauma mean to you? Most people think that trauma has to be this big catastrophic event, or it has to be something so scary and global that it can't be ignored, such as war and mass destruction or child abuse. But trauma is actually much more than that. And when you start breaking down for people and asking them specific questions, have you ever experienced this? Have you ever experienced that? They're like, yes, I have. And then you're like, that's trauma, right? So I think if we go back to the stats, I think these numbers would be almost 100% if research broadly defined trauma like I do. So let's start by saying that trauma is much more than simply going through a very stressful experience. So trauma is a response that is often overwhelming. It is a rupture in meaning, right? And so not everything that is harmful is a trauma. What you and your body, your well-being will define what trauma is. But it is not just something harmful or sad. It is something life-shattering or changing. Re-traumatization is when the person is reminded of the original event and they have to and are re-experiencing it all over again in that moment as if it was happening to them right then and there. And that's what a trauma-informed approach really tries to prevent, is re-traumatization. Trauma can happen to anyone, but research shows that it is more likely to happen to individuals who are marginalized or oppressed or certain cultures or groups, right? So in the US, Black Americans and Hispanic Americans are more likely to experience trauma than white Americans. I know Australia has a similar social determinants of health. Globally, many refugees often survive traumatizing ordeals, including witnessing the executions and starvations and violence, right? So yes, trauma knows no boundaries, knows no age, and can happen to anyone. But anyone who's a member of a minority group or a cultural minority group or have been marginalized or oppressed in any way are even more likely to have experienced trauma. So here's where I start to break down the types of trauma. Research has found, and I've found in my years of doing this, that there are 12 types of trauma. And that's what makes this topic so important, because so many people think that most people end up thinking that trauma is an individual experience, although they recognize that there's, some group or historical issues here. But this is where, when I ask people, what does trauma mean to you? Can you define it for me? They end up giving me individual experiences. And you'll see just by looking at this map that trauma is much more than that. So to save time, and also because I can't see your faces, so I don't really want to dig into them too much and give too much detail, I've instead tried to simplify them here for you. So an individual trauma is something that is a trauma that happens to one individual person, right? And so this could be a mugging or a sexual assault. It is something traumatic that happens to a person. Developmental trauma is something that occurs across developmental periods in life. So that could be child abuse or senior or elder abuse. Interpersonal trauma happens between people who know each other, right? So this could be intimate partner violence, but it is also bullying. I think it's also, let me pause, time out, to say that as I list these traumas, I think what's important to remember is, I'm going to list them one by one. They are not linear. They are not mutually exclusive. One type of trauma can be more than another type of trauma. And experiencing one can lead to another or compound or make something else worse, right? So you'll notice that, especially when I break down, like racial trauma, for example, can also be an individual, but it can also be a group, collective, or community trauma. But nevertheless, let me circle back. So developmental trauma occurs across developmental stages in life. The one we tend to think about the most is childhood trauma, but there's more than that, including senior or elder abuse. Intimate partner violence and bullying is an example of interpersonal trauma. Secondary trauma is what happens to someone after. It can happen indirectly or directly. And indirectly after hearing about or witnessing someone else's trauma, right? Or, and so indirectly is hearing it, directly is seeing it yourself. So that's including seeing or hearing about a major car accident, right? Vicarious is similar to secondary trauma, but it's different in that secondary trauma can happen even after one event. So after seeing or hearing about one trauma. So this often happens to researchers, and this is what can happen to moderators. After moderating content and seeing even one post that is upsetting, or for researchers, hearing someone tell their story in an interview, it can cause secondary trauma. Vicarious trauma is a little different, and that vicarious trauma develops over time, right? So secondary trauma can be one time, vicarious trauma happens over time. And so basically the best example is this is what happened to doctors and nurses during the COVID-19 pandemic. Over time, as they began to witness what was happening to the patients they were trying to save their lives of, they developed vicarious trauma, and that's why a lot of doctors around the world quit their practice. Group, community, and collective trauma is what happens to groups and people or communities, right? Because trauma can be individual, but together as the group or the collective, you're also experiencing that. And a good example is firefighters who lose two teammates in a fire, right? Yes, it's an individual trauma, but it's also a group trauma because those firefighters, that firehouse is going through that trauma together. Racial trauma can range from microaggressions all the way up to overt racism. And racial trauma can be racial profiling, over policing of Black people. In America, the killing of Black people by police officers, or the way Asian Americans were treated during and post COVID-19 pandemic. Cultural traumas are something that happens to the culture that changes and impacts them for generations to come. And so in Australia, that's examples of the centuries of injustice perpetrated against Native people. That's the same as Canada. The US does the same. Historical trauma is something that's happened a long time ago in history that still has impact today, and will forever have traumatic impact to people. In the US, that's the 9/11 attacks, but that's also the Holocaust and slavery. In fact, recent research is epidemiology is beginning to find that Holocaust survivors 14 generations later still experience the exact same trauma as if it was happening to them in this moment. Natural traumas are often referred to as acts of God, and because they happen out of there's nothing we can do about them, right? So that's tsunamis, tornadoes, and earthquakes. There are 3 types of human-caused traumas: accidents, technology, and accidental. So accidents is something that happens, how do I say? Okay, an American example is, I don't know if any of you are American, and if you watch football, the National Football League. But 2 years ago, I am a diehard member of the Bills Mafia. A Buffalo Bills player went down on the field and had a cardiac arrest, and that sent chills through and caused trauma. So that's an accident. Technology is if there's a technological issue, for example, a train derailment. And then finally, mass trauma is something that happens at the mass level. And this is the one most people also tend to think about, so individual and mass. And one example is the nuclear reactor meltdown in the Ukraine. So these are all different types of trauma, and they can happen individually, or more one can happen to a person, group, or collective. I think it's also important to remember that trauma happens in context and within the systems we live and develop. So there are individual factors that impact someone's experience of trauma, right? Such as their socio-demographic makeup, like SES. There's interpersonal, who are you connected to in your family? For example, research shows if you have a family member who's experienced trauma or substance use concern, you are more likely to experience it. The community in which you live will also impact and dictate. It can cause trauma. It can also make your trauma worse. So for example, if you live in impoverished neighborhoods, or in America in a community that was historically redlined, you are more likely to experience trauma, and can it in and of itself can cause trauma. Then there's societal levels of trauma. So that's the society and the culture that you live in, whether it's the United States, for example, or at the global level. What is happening in the society, their policies, their procedures, their practices that can cause trauma and make it worse. And then finally, there is the time in history. And I think the best example of this is my story at the beginning, when I say that I tried to publish this work when years ago in academic computing spaces said, what is trauma? Why do we need to care about it? Then COVID-19 pandemic happened and light bulb moment, they're like, oh, whoops. And so I think that period in history was life-changing for this kind of work, because it was almost like a neon flashing sign or a slap in the face to the world what trauma really is, and that we cannot ignore it. So now that you know what trauma is, you might be thinking, okay, Carol, if there's this many types of trauma and that trauma can be almost anything, what is traumatic? And that's basically my answer to that is your body, your lived experience, your mind, your heart, your spirit, your soul will decide that for you. Anything can be a trauma, but not everything is traumatic. Your lived experience and who you are will dictate that. But all trauma, if experienced traumatic, has adverse effects on the mind, bodies, and feelings of those that experience it. And that's why a trauma-informed approach matters, because trauma is not something we can simply get over. Our bodies, minds, brains, feelings are forever changed and rewired, right? So many people who experience trauma go on to live life with very little, if any, problem, but others experience lasting adverse effects. For those that do, it forever changes the brain, the body, and their feelings. I'm not going to dig into all of the medical information that goes into understanding how the brain is changed. Just know that it is. Like, for example, the prefrontal cortex is the part of your brain that deals with your right or wrong, your decision-making processes. That is rewired. And so is your amygdala and hippocampus, which is in charge of your emotions. And that's where your fight or flight comes from. So for those that have experienced trauma, especially those that have experienced a lot of trauma, their fight or flight is almost always on. So everything is, they're more reactive and they cannot do anything about that. And prefrontal cortex is important for kids because your prefrontal cortex doesn't stop developing until you're about 25. And if that is damaged during development, it's forever changed. And so the brain is the one part of your body that cannot rejuvenate itself. So if you cut yourself, right, on your hand, for example, your cells in your body will come here, they will fight that, and they will go back together and they'll close your wound up. Your brain is not like that. If something happens, if there's damage, it's forever, it's permanent, it doesn't rejuvenate, it cannot regrow itself. Often trauma is felt in the body, and now research is beginning to show that many things that seem unrelated to trauma are actually linked to and cause trauma, including cardiovascular disease, learning disabilities are all linked to trauma. And then it forever changes your feelings. You can either feel too much or too little. Your fight or flight is either always on or never on. And that's what happens to the human body, soul, spirit after they've experienced trauma. It also changes our sense making. Someone who has experienced trauma has to construct a new understanding of themselves, others, in the world around them. Changes the way we trust people, institutions, and organizations we interact with. And in wake of this, we have to develop the new mental models and new ways of understanding. And we often develop our own coping mechanisms, some of which aren't always healthy, right? So a personal story for me that I think helps drive this home is I was in a terrible accident in the middle of my PhD. I now forever distrust cars. I now forever am afraid to walk across the street. And every single time I cross the street, I say, please don't hit me with your car, right? And I can't help it, right? So I no longer trust cars and drivers, and my sense of safety in this world has forever been changed. And that's what happens to folks. And again, your socio-demographic makeup and who you are is going to determine that for you. Unfortunately, you don't get to have a say as to what is traumatic and what is not. Your body will make this decision for you. I wish to God that it wasn't traumatic for me, and I wish that I didn't have the changes that I've experienced, but there's nothing that I can do about it, and neither can you. The event will decide for you. Your capacity for coping, resiliency, whether you have a social support in place or not, all of that comes into play to determine what is traumatic. Here are a few symptoms and signs to look out for in yourself and in others. If you notice any of these or all of these are things that you have to pay attention to because it could be a symptom of trauma. So psychologically, if you're just feeling angry and irritability, or on the other end of the spectrum, always sad, if you're having difficulty regulating your emotions and you ever think, why can't I just relax? Because you can't. Or physically, if you're having a lot of pain or headaches or muscle tension, chronic pain is now, and research is showing this, linked to trauma. And that's what makes chronic pain so hard to treat, is that it is actually psychological and linked to trauma. Cognitively, if you have problems with your working memory, if you have problem solving, like you were very good at problem solving before and now you just can't seem to do it. If you have these intrusive thoughts or flashbacks, these are all signs of a traumatic experience or that you have experienced trauma. And please, again, don't suffer in silence. This is where you should reach out for help. So now that you have an understanding of what trauma is and how big and widespread it could be, this is what you can do about it as a moderator. This is how you can make your moderation techniques and policies more trauma informed, but also how you can apply this to take care of yourself. Because being trauma informed isn't just about taking care of the communities we serve and work with. It is equally about taking care of ourselves and each other. So I use SAMHSA, so the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration here in the United States, has spent years researching this topic along with fellow social workers, because trauma-informed approaches have been at the crux of social work practice for like 50 years or more. And so with a bunch of experts who know this, SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, did so much research with so many people across America and came up with these 6 guiding principles. It is these six guiding principles that you use to create a trauma-informed approach. Again, while you'll see them on the screen as linear, they are not. They all are interconnected, build on each other, and you can't have a trauma-informed approach unless you have all of these. And the way that they are put into your process can vary just as long as they're all there. I'm going to quickly review each one of these for you. But before I do, I want to say here's an analogy I like to give for folks to learn, to say, okay, this is the approach. Here's my analogy. The trauma-informed approach and the 6 principles I like to say is like a salad, right? So at the basics of a salad, traditional mixed green salad, you start with your lettuce, your vegetables, your dressings, etc., right? Trauma-informed approach, you start with these 6 principles. Then you begin to build your salad and you put in what you want. I like a little bit of this, some green apples or some nuts, and here's some seasoning. You put them together, at the end, you have a salad. Same with the trauma-informed approach. You might need more of one principle than another, but as long as they're all in there, you'll make a salad. You'll make a trauma-informed approach. It also doesn't matter just like it doesn't matter in a salad, if I start with empowerment or start with trustworthiness. Doesn't matter if I start with cucumbers and then eventually add the lettuce. At the end of the day, we're going to shake it around. We're going to make it a salad. You're going to do the same with the principles of a trauma-informed approach. And the trauma-informed approach is very individualized. So you will not get a checklist. There is no such thing as if you do this, then you are. Because each incident, each technology, each moderation, each social media platform, each research protocol is going to dictate how much you need of what. right? And how that should all go into your policies, procedures, and practices. So the key is just learning what the principles are and then figuring out how you need to apply them in your work. And that's where, as a group, I'm really hoping we can dig into this. So the first one I'm going to talk about is safety. So the principle of safety is made up of two things: physical safety and emotional safety. Both must be present. People must feel physically and emotionally safe. You must feel physically and emotionally safe to be trauma informed. The physical safety involves the space in which the interactions occur. So that's the actual physical space. So in an office space, it's the four walls, the doors, the windows, the floor, etc. And online, it is the actual physical space, the website, the form, the social media platform, etc. Emotional safety is about being attentive to signs of discomfort and checking in, debriefing, providing support. So people need to know that they're physically safe, but also emotionally safe, that it is safe for them to show up in whatever beautiful, messy self they are. So examples of ensuring that you are physically safe and emotionally safe include things like the wall colors, app colors, font colors, etc. Because colors change how we feel. That's why if you've ever walked into a hospital, it's often mint green in color, because research has found that that's a relaxing and welcoming color. It is also not threatening and people feel safer in it. It's also thinking about accessibility and security. If in a physical space, it's the arrangement of chairs. So I think a good example of a space I was in, a physical space that wasn't safe. As a PhD student, I was attending a talk for a faculty member. I didn't know who it was, what it was about. I just showed up because good PhD students just show up. And I sat near the front of the room because I showed up early. The room became packed. There wasn't an empty seat in the house. People were standing. And in fact, many of them were blocking the exit. So it was, you can picture this in your head. There was no room to be found. Unbeknownst to me, the presentation was about death and dying. And I had just recently lost someone. I was triggered. I started to, what I like to call, ugly cry. I had such a traumatic response. I had never felt that sense. And I looked around the room and I couldn't get out. It was blocked, it was packed, I couldn't get out of the room. In order for me to get out of the room, I was going to have to ask like 20 people to get out of the way. I was so scared, overwhelmed, that I just collapsed. That wasn't physically and emotionally safe. This is, if you've ever logged into a website, like in the United States, I'm going to use this as an example, the Trevor Project. It's a non-for-profit organization that works with the LGBTQ plus community. Trevor Project on their website has a quick exit button as one of the first things you'll notice when you open up their website. That is the quick exit button is no different than the quick exit out the door. That's ensuring safety, so that anytime someone's using that website, they can close it out and no one needs to know they were there. Trustworthiness and transparency is the next principle I'm going to talk about. So psychology today defines trust as the belief that someone or something can be relied on to do what they say they will. Trustworthiness is the quality of being deserving of trust or confidence. Transparency helps build trust and repair broken trust, because someone who has experienced trauma, as I just talked about a few minutes ago, their trust is broken. I, for example, distrust drivers. I, for example, will distrust the safety of a sidewalk. You're taught to walk in the sidewalk when the little sidewalk person comes on and flashes, and if you follow those rules, you'll be safe. I wasn't, right? So when we are transparent about what we do and why, we build back trust that's broken, or maintain trust or build new trust. To be trustworthy, you need to maintain respectful and appropriate boundaries. You need to do what you say you're going to do. So, for example, links on a website. If you say, if the link is broken, that's a broken trust. Basically, you said you were going to take me there and you didn't, and now you broke my trust, right? That seems so minor, but for someone who's experienced trauma, that could be invoking or triggering. So, and that other examples of applying this principle is be transparent about what data you are collecting, for what purpose, and how it will be used. Be transparent about the decisions that were made as moderators. Like when someone reports content and you block them or they get deleted, be transparent about what happened and why to the extent possible, because it builds trust. Peer support is sometimes the harder one for people in tech and design spaces to think about, like, how do I do this? But peers is anyone with similar lived experience, or for children, it's their parent or guardian. And when we experience trauma or we have any kind of challenge or struggle in life, the first thing we want to know is we're not alone. We want to know other people might feel like we do, and we want someone to listen. We want someone who cares. That's what peer support does. It helps normalize our feelings and experiences, and it aids in our recovery and healing, right? It helps us establish this idea of hope. It helps build trust, which is the previous principle I just spoke about. It can promote healing. And so examples could be supporting each other and normalizing experience as content moderators, who spend their days looking at potentially harmful experiences. You could be a form of peer support for each other, helping to normalize that experience. You can also, I work with some health tech companies who I say you can develop in-app messaging for users who can then do this for each other. And then you can also restorative justice approaches to content moderation, where instead of penalizing them, you help giving them the opportunity to learn from and grow from their experiences. Offer are different forms of peer support. Collaboration and mutuality is really about creating environments of doing with rather than doing for or to someone. And the most important thing in this principle talks about is leveling power, right? We all hold power in this world. As a researcher, I hold power over my participants. As moderators, you hold power over the communities you design for, and companies that you work for have power over you. And collaboration and mutuality of doing things with each other starts to balance that power out. And that's the most important thing, because someone who's experienced trauma feels powerless. So we want to give them some of their power back, and working with them collaboratively and mutually helps achieve that, right? So include users in decision making, give people options before removing their content, for example, could be ways of enacting the principle of collaboration and mutuality. Empowerment, voice, and choice is exactly that. It is realizing that people have their own capacities and should be able to make choices. It focuses on their strengths and helps them find solutions for themselves. It helps cultivate self-efficacy and self-advocacy. So in social work, we like to think of this as the strength-based approach. In social work, we say everyone has the capacity to help themselves. I just help them help themselves, right? And we can do that by giving people voice and choice. We can empower them to make better choices, to follow the rules by giving them voice and choice. So in research, an example of that is that's what an informed consent process is in research. It is giving them all the information they need to know so that they can make an informed choice. Other examples are user-friendly terms of service instead of these big, long-winded legal things that no one ever reads. If they're wired down to user-friendly terms, that can give people feel empowered, and then they can make better choices. And opt-in instead of opt-out policies are the same. And then finally, the last principle, and I say it's the last because it's at the end of that line originally, but it's cultural, historical, and gender issues. But I think what's important is, while it's hanging out at the end and it might sound different to you, it's important to know that it underscores the entire trauma-informed approach. One cannot be trauma-informed if they're not inclusive, equitable, just, and intentional. You have to consider all the current and historical structures and events that can impact and cause trauma. That's what this principle is reminding you of. It is saying, remember, people live in context is they live in historical events, they live in societies, and all of that causes and underscores their traumatic experience. So we have to do our best to remember that, to bring our best selves to work, and try to address all of these. So, for example, policies that consider cultural, racial, and historical identities, having gender responsive moderation policies. And that starts with realizing that gender is not binary, right? So it's just being the good people that I know we are and doing our best to try to do better. That's what this principle is saying. It is also a step away from the medical model, because sometimes when the brain and when we talk about all the changes, it's very medicalized. This remembers that this helps us remember that trauma is systemic, and that's basically what this is trying to do. So why does this all matter? Once when you're trauma informed, there's these, we like to say that you've achieved the 4 R's. So when you become trauma informed, you realize the first step is to realize that trauma is widespread and understand that it is experienced by everyone. Once you realize what trauma is, you can recognize the signs and symptoms in yourself, in the communities you serve and work with. When you recognize it, you can respond, right? You can apply the principles and do your very best to not make it worse, which is where the resist re-traumatization occurs. So when you apply a trauma-informed approach, it is life-changing and potentially life-saving. It is also what I like to call a harm reduction approach. So it is not saying that, social media, for example, has become public enemy number one, and politicians and policymakers are saying get offline. Well, that's not probably going to be very accurate, because there's a lot of good things that happen on social media and online. Instead, we need trauma-informed social media, trauma-informed technology, so kids just don't have to work so hard, right? And that's basically what this is saying. It's not saying you don't have to use it, let's just do it so you can use it more safely, right? And that's what a trauma-informed approach is. It is also a universal precaution. So we have all seen physicians in one way or another, and one of the first things you'll notice they do when they walk into a room is they put on their gloves. No one ever thinks twice about it, because it's a universal precaution, right? It's just a way to protect you and them. A trauma-informed approach is the exact same thing. It is also, this is a new analogy I also like to say, it is also the seatbelts and airbags of technology. So in the beginning, when we made the auto industry responsible for their product, right? As a society, we said, okay, your products are killing people. What can you do to do better to protect them? And when we first suggested as a society that there should be seatbelts and airbags, the auto industry was like, no one's going to buy my car, I'm doomed. Now you can't imagine driving a car that doesn't have a seatbelt and an airbag. So trauma-informed technology, trauma-informed moderation are the equivalent to seatbelts and airbags. We're not going to change, we're going to protect and do better, right? And people will still use your products and services. And why is it important for the communities we serve? It will help mitigate or reduce trauma and re-traumatization. We are all the world is a dumpster fire right now. And basically a trauma-informed approach helps us not make that worse. It can build trust with your communities. It's about it's an equity and ethics issue of first doing no harm. And it can also improve retention and satisfaction, right? It can make people happier to use your product, happier with you as a moderator in your decisions. For moderators, I think it's a perfect fit. Moderators, you all do what you do because you want to make communities safer, better. You care about people's well-being. So this to me just is a no-brainer. It also builds on things you already aim to do, including DEI and accessibility. And so it just works well or marries well with other things that you're already doing. It will also improve your retention and productivity and make life better for you. And most importantly, applying trauma-informed approach helps mitigate secondary trauma so that y'all can have a long and healthy career. Because doing your job is hard enough and can lead to burnout. So let's apply a trauma-informed approach so that doesn't happen. And I don't know if any of you have experienced burnout, but I have. And I found this image very enlightening, because at one point I would have put myself down here around stage 11, right? So this is what happens to content moderators who look at traumatic content all day long. You can't help but take it home with you. Same with social work. You're a human who cares, and with everything else going on in this world and all the other things happening to you and with you, burnout can happen before you know it. And the best way, or one of the ways I can think of to reduce or prevent this, is applying a trauma-informed approach to caring for yourself. I also think it is good for business and the bottom line. There's lots of research. Again, I don't have it in tech spaces, but I do have it in social work clinical practice that finds trauma-informed clinical practice increases revenue. It increases trust people experience in their companies. In substance abuse and mental health treatment, it reduces recidivism, which is or reoccurring needs for treatment, which is really the whole goal of treatment, is to not have to have people come back. So lives are getting better, companies are making more money. And I imagine similar could be for social media and big tech companies who invest in this for their moderation policies. So I think I just have a few more ideas about how we can apply this to protect the communities we work with. And first, I think some ways that we can protect community members who report content, for example. I think the option to report harmful content is, in fact, in and of itself, already using the principle of empowerment, voice, and choice. I also think it achieves or helps achieve safety, right? And it is also a form of collaboration and mutuality. So the fact that I get to press a button on my social media or whatever when I see harmful content, or when someone sends me a DM that is bullying or harmful, is empowering and gives me voice and choice. I also feel safer because I know that I can do this, and it's collaborative because I feel like I'm working with the platform. But we can be more transparent, for example, if we tell them what happened and why, right? So I did research with here in the United States with Center for Democracy and Technology. This, in the slides, this will link you to that report. And what my colleague and I did is we recruited a diverse group of American youth ages 13 to 21, and we asked them about the kind of content they send and receive in their DMs. And while that was shocking, and I'm not going to dig into what they said, what they did say is there was a lot of them that wanted to know what happened. A lot of them said that they reported the content, they reported the user, and then they never heard back what happened. And they earned for that. They wanted to know what happened and why. Was that person removed? Because a lot of them said, because not long later, I got another message. And so what happened? Why didn't that person go? Or how did they get to open a new account? How did they get to come back and keep hurting me, right? So American youth want to know what happened. They also find it empowering, and they just want to know more, right? So I think sharing what happened to the extent possible, and the decisions you made and why you made them, is very trauma informed, and it is what American youth, so I imagine youth across the world, would like. We also have to think about those that post the harmful content, right? So we shouldn't just delete the account and bury the trauma, right? I think we can apply the principle of trustworthiness and transparency by also letting them know what happened and why. I think it is also a form of support and collaboration. I think it is, we could also use restorative justice or procedural justice principles and give them the opportunity to learn and grow instead of punish. With the realization that we have to think about cultural, historical, and gender issues because certain populations are historically more harmed online than others. And so I just wanted to give a few ideas here about what I thought about, because I often think we think about the person who is harmed, but we forget about the person who did the harming, because as we know, trauma is cyclical. And those that are doing the harming were likely also harmed somewhere in their life, right? So we have to care about both sides of the story. I also think about context as well as content moderation, right? So oftentimes we evaluate things at the content level, whether it violated our policies by the words used, for example. But we know complex behaviors like trauma can't be understood or separate from the context in which they occur. A social work colleague of mine, Desmond Patton, works a lot with American gangs and who use technology. And they say that they post online and share things online as a way of healing from their grief and a way of building community. But they often find all of their content is deleted because it violates laws and policies. And again, all of that was taken out of context, right? So I think to the extent possible, we should, to be more trauma informed, think about context as well as content, right? Because I think it's just one extra way that we can be a little bit more trauma informed. And then equally, how do we apply this to caring for moderators, caring for yourself and other people? Moderators engage with harmful, potentially traumatic content as part of their daily job because people are beautifully messy offline and they take that online. And this can be especially invoking if you can relate to it. If you have any lived experience, you love someone who has lived experience, or you know someone who has lived experience of the type of stuff that you are looking at and moderating all day long, it will become traumatic and can lead to secondary or vicarious trauma. So it is equally harmful for you as it is for the people for our communities that you serve. The first step I'd like to say to folks who want to be more trauma informed and take care of themselves is to practice something in social work that we do in social work. It's called critical self-reflection. Basically, it's the process of getting to know yourself and the beautiful, messy person you are, your ways of knowing, thinking, behaving, seeing the world, interacting with the world. Once you truly know yourself, you can know your limits and play within them. You can know what job you should and shouldn't do. You should know when to take your breaks. Critical self-reflection is basically the first step. I like to think of it as journaling. And I know, icky, clinical, but trust me, it's therapeutic. And you only need 5 minutes a day to just sit down and start thinking through. If you've ever experienced something or you're struggling with something, write about it. Dig into feeling and figuring out why you feel that way, where it comes from. And before you know it, you've had an awakening and an enlightening. And I think this also is something that in DEIA practices, you can't be aware and prevent harm until you're aware of your implicit biases. And so critical self-reflection can also help here. Is you can dig into what is your lived experience, how can it help or hurt you, and then make informed decisions about your work. I also think if there's, to the extent possible, ways to limit exposure, including machine learning and natural language processing. I think AI in some ways, I hate the idea of AI taking our jobs over. In some ways, it is helpful in that you don't have to see those kinds of things all day long. I think companies should also support moderators to develop healthy boundaries and setting limits. I think it's important to develop your self-care plan and to reach out to peer support and never suffer in silence. I think sometimes we think, and in some cultures more than others, don't complain about it, just bury it. I think that's counterproductive. And so I think you need to the extent possible, reach out for help and take care of yourself. And of course, I always take the responsibility back where it belongs and put it on the companies that moderators work for should do better. They should offer trauma-informed training. They should have dedicated trauma team members and leaders who can recognize and respond to signs that they're seeing in their employees. There should be sources available for mental health, including counseling, like secondary or vicarious trauma experts. And I also think, and my whole end goal is for companies to eventually become trauma-informed themselves. Because my vision of trauma-informed social media is so that kids don't have to work so hard, but that's the vision for a company, is so that employees don't have to work so damn hard. The trauma-informed approach is a journey. It is a marathon, not a sprint. I've been doing this for over a decade and I still learn new things every day. So give yourself grace, slowly learn this. And the Missouri Department of Health created this model to help people break down the process of becoming and maintaining trauma-informed, where you start at pre-aware and move to and end or maintain a trauma-informed approach. So know that this is a journey in a life process, and that one training or one workshop is not going to get you there. It is one of many steps you need to take. I also encourage you to continue your journey and reach out to your colleagues. And again, please reach out if you have or need me in any way.